Hi, I'm Carlos Baradat, founder of the Baradat Group, a law firm and business IT consulting company, and president of the Virtual Jurist, where we help set up the technology that law firms need in order to operate in a virtual environment. Now, this is the Virtual Jurist podcast, where we discuss the newest innovations in technology related to the legal profession and the impact that it has in your practice. In today's episode, we talk to Craig Sixta, VP of Security and Compliance at Element Technologies. Craig and I will discuss the challenges that many law firms face today when it comes to protecting client data, why law firms are such a prime target for hackers, and offer us some tips that any business can use to not only protect their clients' data, but minimize the damage if their data has been compromised. So with that being said, let's welcome Craig. So first of all, welcome, Craig. Thanks for being here. I thought that before we get started, you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience in the law firm technology field, and what it is that you do over there at Element Technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Carlos. For the last 20 years or so, I've been helping organizations develop best-in-class technology solutions, as well as protecting their people and their data. I seem to have a knack for being able to quickly understand complex systems and scenarios and come up with creative solutions. If you've heard about it before, the Colin Powell's 47 rule, I really live by that. You gather 40 to 70% of the data, and then you go with your gut. It avoids making quick, rash decisions, and then also avoids paralysis by analysis. That area in cybersecurity is so absolutely critical because when an event happens, we often don't have time to gather 100% and then make a decision. Things are moving very quickly. Because of this, I've been fortunate to work on threats, compromises, investigations with some very high-profile clients and organizations throughout the country. I tell people, because it sounds amusing now, at the time it was terrifying, but I've had jobs where the directions were meet me at the bench next to the two garbage cans in Central Park and wait for further instructions. No idea who the client is, no idea what's happening. Somebody picks me up in a vehicle and then I go do the job. And 24 hours after that job, I was in LA working on another compromise. And so unfortunately they happen a lot, but it is an exciting field to be in. And I've had clients in the legal industry for many, many years, but it's really since joining Element Technologies that my focus has really been on law firms. We support hundreds of law firms, everything from document management, managed IT services, cybersecurity, and strategic advising. And at Element, my primary focus right now is really cybersecurity, forensics, e-discovery, and then working with them on compliance.
Yeah. And working with law firms and having that experience working with law firms is really great, right? Because, it is a little bit different, right? Attorneys have to work with rules of professional conduct and duties of confidentiality and those type of things that, may not be the same with the average business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is kind of interesting that the joke I say, and it's actually not really a joke, is I work a lot with financial institutions, medical institutions, and law firms. The difference is financial institutions and medical institutions, in a lot of cases, have to be compliant. Law firms want to be compliant, and it is a completely different mindset. And this is not universal across the board by any stretch of the imagination, but there does seem to be a general trend where it's give me the bare minimum so I can check the box. But with law firms, it's what do I need to do to protect my clients here? So working with law firms really has been enjoyable from that aspect.
That's good. And we'll talk about that a little bit later because essentially there's really no substantive regulation governing cybersecurity in law firms. There's some guidance between the rules, but nothing like HIPAA or, FDIC or even the GDPR.
Yeah, and that depends on what the law firm is holding for data. Some law firms aren't even aware that they need to be HIPAA compliant or pay attention to GDPR, and they really do, depending on what areas of law they practice and what they're protecting.
That's really an excellent point. So then that brings us to, as a general rule, do you think that lawyers have a good understanding of their cybersecurity infrastructure?
It's a great question. One of my passions is public speaking and training lawyers in the areas of cybersecurity and digital ethics. I've spoken to law firms and organizations all around the world, and I can honestly say that's a very tough one to answer. I think for the most part, lawyers just want to do their job and do the best they can for their clients. And unfortunately, that often means that they ignore some critical aspects of security. They view it as unnecessary or inconvenient until something bad happens.
Okay.
And that's kind of the sad part about our job. I just was asked this yesterday by a potential client, and they had just been breached. How often do people call you before a breach? And it's almost never. I would say 95% of our work starts with, we've had a breach. Now what do we do to protect ourselves better? As opposed to, we really should protect ourselves so this breach never happens. So it's tough.
So you would agree then? So most would probably just delegate that type of, I guess, responsibility. I hate to use the word responsibility, but they basically delegate it to the IT provider or their particular IT department to handle.
Yeah, and I see that. And the interesting thing, a lot of IT professionals and security professionals would not like to admit this, but the fact of the matter is it really is 90% our responsibility for protecting these organizations and protecting lawyers. A lawyer is practicing law. They are not building the strong defenses of cybersecurity. We really need to do that. But then there is that 10% that is the attorney's responsibility. The one thing that I like to make the analogy of is the idea of a fort. We're about to be attacked. We're all standing on the walls of the fort. The person next to you can't say, hey, this isn't my job. I'm going to go do something else. We've got this first world mentality when it comes to so many things that we're safe, we're watched, we're protected. There's always the police to go to. And when it comes to cybersecurity, that's really not the case. I do a lot of work with law enforcement, and it was a humorous situation. I was in a sheriff's office talking to the county sheriff, and he turns to me and he goes, we can never catch you guys. And I went, wait a minute. I'm a good guy. I'm not the bad guy. You guys, that's them. And he goes, yeah, but we can never catch you. And I think a lot of people forget that when it comes to cybersecurity and cybercrime, a lot of these attacks are from outside the country. They're behind anonymous VPNs. It's very, very difficult to catch them, which means we don't have these outside people protecting us. So listen to your IT people, listen to your security people. Let's build great high walls to protect ourselves. But at the end of the day, as a lawyer, it's your responsibility, our responsibility to know how to use our tools. And it's not as simple as how do I use Word or Excel. It's how do I protect my client's data? What do I need to do to make sure it's safe throughout the entire process?
Mm-hmm. No, that's very well said. I mean, I always tell the clients, ultimately, as a lawyer, the buck stops here.
Mm-hmm.
So that is why it's so important. And, you and I have had the pleasure of working together on many occasions, when we talked with clients, to get them involved really throughout the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely. And one great example I had that this just happened yesterday, actually, is I got forwarded an email, and this was from a financial firm, not a law firm, but I've seen this happen at law firms, and they said this was a highly sophisticated attack, and they were all upset about this because what happened was the accounting department nearly wired $41,000 to a bad actor. Now, the fact of the matter is that financial person was just trying to do their job. Somebody asked for help, but when they said highly sophisticated attack, I looked at it and it literally started, and I'm sure we've all seen this before, an email, Gmail, from a guy named John saying, hey, can you give me a call quick, or can you email me quick? And the next email was, hey, your firm, we've done a bunch of work for you. Can you please wire us $41,000 right away to take care of the payment? Wow. And this financial person didn't even think anything of it and said, sure, we'll get it. And she tried as hard as she could to wire the money. Fortunately, that group had controls in place that stopped that user, but it wasn't a highly sophisticated attack. It was just somebody asking for money.
Interesting. But the firm itself thought it was a highly...
Yep, they thought it was highly sophisticated. And I was thinking, this happens every day. This wasn't even a difficult attempt. This was just somebody throwing out a line and seeing if a fish would bite.
Now, and imagine how often. Well, we worked on those cases where it's with real estate department. That's one of those places where it happens a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where they wire the instructions, and then they get those. They get an email essentially saying that there's a change in the wire instructions, many times the firms send that money away. Sometimes in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, and sometimes they don't realize it till it's far too late because they don't have controls in place. If you read the news, and this is kind of funny as much as it is sad, but the security controller for a large grocery chain named Kroger's, he went on vacation for 2 weeks, and a low-level employee realized he was gone and defrauded the organization of $980,000 in 2 weeks. Wasn't smart enough to actually try to get away, but he bought some cars and some other things, and then he got caught. But it's a great example of if you're not paying attention, it's not very difficult for somebody to run away with the money.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always maintained that law firms are a great target to would-be hackers because essentially, you have banks, right? That they have all your information regarding your financials, right? You have hospitals and doctors that keep all of your personal information. You have your accountants that know where all your money is. But then you have lawyers who in many cases know where all that information, everything about that information, because they're working on a case for you in which they've had to obtain those documents. So to me, that makes them such a great target for would-be hackers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to have all that information in one place, because when bad actors are trying to this is all about money for them. It's all about how do we make the most money. And we all know that lawyers and law firms are sitting on absolutely critical information. And sometimes it's not just PII, personally identifiable information. Sometimes it's intellectual property that would be useful for competing corporations. It's highly confidential information about professional athletes or actors or actresses. I've worked with a law firm that had social security numbers for many, many famous people in Hollywood. And just to think if that gets out, how damaging it could possibly be. But I think another aspect of that people don't often think about, and that you and I have both seen, is that the bad actors, when they compromise a law firm, can weaponize that law firm against other people and against clients. And we had that happen over Thanksgiving, where a law firm that we weren't supporting was basically victimized by a phishing attack, an email that asked for credentials for Office 365. And then what happened was, once they'd compromised that law firm, an actual attorney sends out an email saying, here's a secure message, please check it right away. We all trust that if we get an email from an attorney that we know that attorney, well, this must be a secure message. They must have something to talk about. And we watched this fraud go through hundreds of organizations, get opened thousands of times. It was just devastating because it came from a trusted source, that law firm. And it's so damaging for that law firm's reputation. Now they've just sent scam emails to judges, competing law firms, to clients, to everything. Wow. And then, as we talked about earlier, the client wire fraud, where somebody, and unfortunately law firms can't always control this, but they should at least be aware enough of what the threat is to know what it is, where somebody gets in the middle, takes that real email from a real estate attorney, changes the wiring information, and the client has wire fraud happen. Now that compromise, 95% of the time happens on the client end, not the law firm end, but the client's pointing the finger at the law firm saying, you should have known better. Why didn't you stop me from doing this? And we've had some difficult situations with that.
Yeah, worked on cases with exactly those type of facts. In fact, so that wouldn't you agree then that old adage where in terms of cybersecurity, that the protection of a law firm is only as strong as its weakest link, right? I mean, we can have a law firm really of any size, solo or a large firm that spends, tens of thousands of dollars on security, on firewalls, on securing servers, on encryption. Really, all that goes away by the click of a single link, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the challenges is when it comes to cybersecurity, these threats for the average person are really nebulous. They're so scary, people don't understand them, so they just don't know what to do. So they kind of forget about them. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things I try to do when I do my security awareness training is to show people what it really looks like so they know how to respond. If I say, hey, I was carjacked last night, you've got a mental picture, whether it's from TV shows, movies, hopefully not personal experience, but you know what a carjacking is. If I say, hey, I was just victimized by a man-in-the-middle attack and they stole $40,000, most people just shake their head and go, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so when I do training, I'll actually show live demonstrations, because if somebody understands that, oh, this is how they're doing it, and if I do these two things, I'm going to be safe. Yeah. And so one of the areas when we talk about weakest links is really social engineering. And we actually do this for law firms where we test their defenses to see where the weak areas are. And frankly, why am I going to waste all that time, as you were talking about, going through tens of thousands of dollars worth of highly sophisticated antivirus, endpoint protection response, firewalls? when I can just call the front receptionist and ask if somebody's in the office today or not. And then when I find out they're not, walk in and go into their office. And I've done that many times. It's amazing how look at a law firm, figure out the most common name. And by the way, I'm teaching you how to be the bad guy now. Walk into the law firm and say, hey, I'm here to see Mike. Look down an empty hallway and wave and say, hi, Mike, how you doing? And walk down that hallway. The receptionist feels she's just done her job. She has handed you off to Mike. And at that point, my job is to find the unlocked server room, plug in my device, and then go sit in my car and do whatever I want. And for most law firms, sadly, they're never going to find that device until they take apart the server rack and go, hey, I wonder what this thing was plugged in. Right. And so it's a very real threat.
Interesting, right? I mean, literally what you're hoping for is that somebody's doing their job properly. And if they do, you're in.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And and another thing to talk about when we talk about weakest links as well is a lot of times we think about the people that aren't paying attention. But one of the things I really like to emphasize is where are weak links in planning? We know when it comes to cybersecurity, and I always tell this to people, I can't stop 100% of the threats. As a defender, I have to be right every single time. And as an attacker, they just need to be right once. They just need that one person to fall for a trick. They need something like that. We should have incident response plans in place so when that bad thing happens, we know what to do about it. And I've worked with large organizations, hundreds of servers encrypted at the same time, where the first thing I always ask is, where's the incident response plan? Let's get ready. Let's execute it. Well, we have no idea. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, whether it's cybersecurity, real life, you name it, people make their worst decisions in the heat of battle. They just don't have time. That 40-70 rule, they're looking, they're panicking, and it's just things happen. So there needs to be a plan in place. And that's a weak link with a lot of organizations.
That's really true, and that's where that incident response, those policies come in play, really, to have those, something happens and an attack happens, who do we call first? How do you minimize the damage, really, right? And immediately start working towards a common goal of figuring out, okay, first of all, what just happened, right? Stop it, right? And then begin to really start putting the pieces back together.
Yeah,
one of the, it's interesting because on many occasions where I've been, when I've been brought in with attorneys and even their IT departments, I'll ask the simple question of, when was the last time you did a backup? And of course, oftentimes I get the, we just ran one, last night or 2 hours ago. Great. And then the follow-up questions is typically, and when was the last time you tested it? And you'd be surprised. Well, how many times they said, well, I don't think we've ever tested it.
Yeah, absolutely. And sadly, I've seen that. I've seen down networks. I remember one situation with a financial firm where they said, yeah, we're sure we got backups, no big deal. I went to the server room. At the time, they were using tape-based backups, and the tapes were all sitting in wrappers on top of the server. When they had switched server systems, they hadn't got to doing the new backups. And we're talking 6 months to a year later, and those tapes are sitting there gathering dust. Wow. And so as a leader of a law firm, as a leader of an organization, when we talk about that 90-10 rule of, 90% really needs to be on the IT security people, that 10% as leadership, you better know where your backups are and you better know that they work, because backups cover a whole lot of sins. If you've got good backups of things, you've mitigated a lot of risk.
You're absolutely right. So that's why it's so important, that education aspect of all this, right? That weakest link really is in many ways taken care of by education, right? To train those people, constantly training employees and attorneys themselves on how to spot some of these phishing attempts, right? Because in many instances, they're actually rather easy to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. It's little things like looking at the sender's address, and is it actually Netflix.com or is it Netflix.ru for Russia? And there's usually pretty easy tells, but unfortunately with the state of where things are nowadays, I tell people, when you receive an email that asks for anything confidential, you better verify it, because Carlos, you may send me a follow-up email on this. I don't know that your email system's been compromised. And so we need to be very careful with everything that we click on an email, because it really does all come from untrusted sources.
Yeah. So then let's talk about, we've touched on it, but what is ransomware, right? What is ransomware? And can you tell their listeners here a little bit about how it actually affects a computer and a network?
Yeah, absolutely. So well done ransomware, and by and large, this is done by very large organizations, if not nation states overseas. It's ransomware as a service. They have very complex systems, but at its core, what it is a bad actor gains access to a network or a system, and they may do that through an email phishing attack. They may have found some credentials on the internet that happen to work to get into a company. However they do it, they get inside the system. One of the first things they do is they find those backups and they destroy them. And so one of the things I always talk about with organizations is you need to have air-gapped backups. And what that means is there needs to be no connectivity between your backup system and your primary network. So whether they're held in the cloud and they're unable to be deleted, or they're taken off-site and put in a safety deposit box, at some level you need air-gapped backups, because that is one of the first things they do is they wipe them out, and then they go and they encrypt the files.
So for those listening, that in layman's terms, you essentially have to have a backup that doesn't have a wire connected to the computer.
Exactly. If they can crawl the network and get to your backups, or if the same password works to get your cloud-based backups, they'll wipe them out because you're that much more likely to pay the ransom.
So if it's connected to a computer, it can be attacked.
Exactly. And then at that point, they encrypt the files. And the thing is that we normally see is this will happen on a Friday over a weekend, or it'll happen on a holiday weekend. Holiday weekends are always busy for us because that's when so many attacks happen. The reason is people usually aren't paying attention. It starts on a Friday night, and come Monday morning, people come in and they're saying, hey, why can't I open this PDF? And sure enough, there's ransomware. And then on one or more systems, there's a pop-up that says, pay X amount of dollars and we will give you your access to your files back. And the thing is, it used to be 5 years ago for an entire network, they may ask for $1,000. And now we're seeing it exponentially more than that. I mentioned one firm I worked with, 350 servers encrypted, 1,500 computers, and they were asking $70,000 per server to decrypt them. And that's just unbelievable amounts of money. Now, in this case, they had good backups and we were able to restore. But even that restore process took about 5 days to get done. And they figure it cost the firm about $5 million in lost productivity. And that was the best case scenario recovery. Now, one of the plot twists that's really worth mentioning about ransomware that we're starting to see a change is people are getting better at their backups. They're paying less ransoms because of that. So now what we're seeing is we're seeing the bad actors say, pay the ransom or we're publishing your confidential data online. And so, yeah, you can pay to get your backups, but now it's pay the money or we're putting your entire client list online. We're putting these internal conversations that you had, a client attorney privilege, it's going to be on the internet for everybody to see. And so that's a real concern.
That's essentially what that Maze ransomware is doing, right?
Correct.
Essentially, it comes in. Before, it would just encrypt everything, but now it literally pulls everything out. And like you said, now it's, either on the dark web or somewhere ready to be posted for the public to see. And imagine having to write a client a letter stating that just happened. So now what I've seen is that now they have, like you said, 2 ransoms, right? One is to unencrypt the data, and 2, to essentially destroy the data that they've obtained.
Correct. And that's the first question I always get when I walk into a breach, when I walk into what we call the war room. And the war room's usually got C-level execs. It may have an attorney. It's got insurance. It's got the IT or the security people. The first question from the board is always, did they steal our data? And the answer to that, sadly, with many firms, unless you've got some pretty advanced systems, is I can't tell you for sure, because the fact of the matter is they may have screen scraped it, which means they just took pictures of what was on the screen. They may have trickled a few things off. Sometimes it's very hard to tell. You can tell when, gigabytes or terabytes of data go through the firewall and we go, yep, we saw all of this go to, in one of the last breaches, a ton of it went to Ecuador, Russia, and Chicago, which I don't know why it went to Chicago. We're not picking on Chicago, but that's where it went. And we could say, yes, data was taken. But a lot of times, we can't say for sure, and that makes a difficult situation.
Well then, Craig, so are ransomware attacks a matter of prevention awareness? How do you even prepare for such things? And you always have to pay to get your files back. Is there any guarantee that even if you do pay, you'll get your files back? Is the solution sometimes just as simple as having a backup or business continuity solution policy in place?
Yeah, great question. So as far as the prevention aspect of it, it starts like almost every other fraud usually does. Bad password hygiene, falling for a phishing attack. That large breach I mentioned with 350 servers all started because an IT employee in this organization had the same password for his PayPal as he did for his corporate IT account. And so the bad actor compromised his PayPal through a phishing scheme, I'm sure, and then just tried the password because he used his work email for personal use, which is always bad, and tested it. And I can't imagine what that bad actor must have thought when all of a sudden he's looking at hundreds of servers. And so really good security hygiene solves a lot of that. And then as far as getting your files back and paying for it, unfortunately, with some organizations, and we haven't had to do this in the last few years, we do have to pay the ransom. If it's a difference between going out of business or paying a few $1,000s, most organizations are going to pay a few $1,000s. Yeah. And so that's just the fact of the matter.
Wow. That's, and it's only, and really, it's only getting, they're getting better, right? It's always a cat and mouse game, right? They're getting better, and then we have to step up to try to catch what they're doing. But they're the way in which they attack is simply always
it's always improving, and backups are absolutely critical for business continuity. But now we've got that new layer of basically holding your data ransom as opposed to for publishing it. Your backups aren't going to help in that case.
So Craig, what is Element doing in terms of, for the past 30, 40 years, we've used servers at pretty much all, anybody that needed to contain a certain amount of data in their office, but now we have the cloud, right? I mean, are you moving your clients to the cloud? Are you still sort of doing a hybrid? What's the plan here?
We're moving a lot of people to the cloud, but one of the things to remember is the old saying, the cloud is just someone else's server room. We can't just move everything to the cloud and then wipe our hands and say, hey, they're taking care of security. You still need to make sure that things are secure. One of the things we really focus on at Element is simplifying security. Security can get so complex that there's holes and you don't even recognize it. I did an audit on a fairly large law firm a couple of years ago, and it was interesting because they had, you name it for security, they had bought it. And in the middle of me doing the security audit, I looked and I said, do you realize that you have a ransomware attack that had just started? Now, it had been stopped by their system, but they were so well protected, they didn't even know they were being attacked. And you want to know when you're being attacked.
Certainly.
And so we try to really simplify. And I use the analogy of your own home. If you go, okay, I know somebody's going to attack my home, what do? Are my doors locked? Are my windows secure? Do I have motion detectors? There's some very simple things you can do. Networks are the same way. There's doors and windows that people can get through. And if you know how to lock those down, you're secure. The other thing that we really focus on is getting away from this, what I like to call antivirus mentality. Traditional antivirus is signature based. And what that's like is when you walk into the bank and you see the wanted posters on the wall. That's how antivirus works is, hey, this person's on the wanted poster, I should stop them. We're moving towards behavior-based and machine learning-based solutions. So instead of that wanted poster, it says, hey, this guy just walked into the bank. He's holding a ski mask in one hand, and I see a gun tucked in his belt. We probably have a problem here. Let's block this behavior. And so what that may look like for law firms and for organizations is, hey, we just saw Carlos log in Naples, Florida at 8 o'clock this morning, and a half hour later, he just logged in Los Angeles, California, or worse, Lagos, Nigeria. Let's shut down that account automatically until we figure out what happened. Now, it was his password, it was his username, he had every right to do that, but the behavior seems wrong. It may be the paralegal that all of a sudden is downloading 50,000 files out of the doc management system, and normally they work on 100 files a day. Let's block access, let's figure out what the behavior is. And so it's all based around this behavior, and it has saved organizations. One CPA firm we worked for, two of the principals fell for the exact same phishing attack, gave up their email credentials. In a normal situation, we would not have known that they would have done with that until the bad actors took the next step, the wire fraud, the phishing attack, something like that. In this case, our system detected that they logged in Moscow within 5 minutes of logging in Bloomington, Minnesota. And so we shut down those accounts immediately, no damage done whatsoever. And then training followed.
Oh, immediately, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, those audits are so important, right? Having, constant quarterly audits, yearly audits, so that you have an understanding of, first of all, I always like to have, an entire map of the, the infrastructure of the office, everything having to do, not just the hardware, but all the databases. And then I'm a big proponent of compartmentalizing, right? I mean, you don't want everybody to have access to everything. And permissions is something that should be checked often, right? Who has access to what?
Yes.
And so that you can essentially be able to have that audit trail, right? This person has access to this. So it's a place to start from.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's neat that you bring that up, because in security, we call it the idea of least privilege. If a user doesn't need access to something, don't give it to them. If they only need read-only access, only give them that. And I work with so many organizations. Well, it's just easier. If everyone's an admin, then they can just do their job and I don't have to do much. That creates a problem. And the funny thing is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Carlos, because I think this started in the legal profession and really made its way and is more prevalent in cybersecurity now, is the idea of non-repudiation, the inability for somebody to deny that they did something. And I'm constantly pushing that with all of my organizations is, if this is your username and password, and especially with multi-factor authentication, I can say for sure Carlos logged in at noon on Sunday. He can't deny it because he was the only one that could have. Yeah. And when you're sharing passwords, when you have lax security, when multiple people have access to the same resource and it's not being logged or audited, bad things happen. And well, it was this person's account, but we really don't know because she shares her password with 5 different people, or she doesn't lock her computer and it's in a cubicle. We really push that idea of non-repudiation. If something happens, I can point at somebody and say for sure, I know it was them that did that.
So then let's talk about that for just a moment, because I think it'll be very helpful to our listeners. Let's talk about passwords, okay, and some protection that we can do. Let's talk a little bit about passwords, the type of passwords, complexity of passwords. How often should we change them? Two-factor authentication.
Yeah. Absolutely. So the thing that's really changed in the security community is the how often you should change them is never. And that is a fundamental change in the fact that we have organizations every 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. And what security professionals saw is if I require someone to change their password every 90 days, then summer 19 becomes winter 19, becomes spring 2020. And you see a pattern there. And as a bad actor, if I get a password that's 2 years old, odds are I'm going to figure out what the pattern is, because people follow patterns. Now, as far as changing passwords, if multi-factor authentication is in place, and the consensus is it should be on everything that's internet accessible. But if multi-factor authentication is in place, that password isn't the only stopgap to get in the network. And now you can ask people, let's create a longer, more complex password. And guess what? You never have to change it again unless you think that that password is compromised. And so one of the things, I don't do it as often anymore, but I used to speak at security conferences and I would share my Gmail password. And I have literally not changed my Gmail password in 6 years because it's sitting behind secure multi-factor authentication. I have no concerns because in order for somebody to get into my Gmail, they need hands on my exact phone. So now there's no risk of Russia or Nigeria or you down in Naples getting to it because you have to have my phone and have logged into my phone.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's and the companies, the software that most attorneys use really have made it fairly simple for anybody to have multi-factor authentication. I mean, there's really no excuse. All banks pretty much, give you the opportunity to do that, right? Office 365, you can do that. Gmail allows you to have two-factor authentication.
Yeah, pretty much all this, Amazon, Facebook, you name it, have some form of it. The one recommendation that you should not do is don't use your phone for texting. For when you get the SMS, 6-digit code, as much as possible, use Google's got an application. There's one called Authy. There's a bunch of them out there. Use the one that generates that rolling code every 30 seconds. It is more secure. But when we're talking about corporate environments and law firms, there's even a step beyond that. There's a solution called single sign-on. And the neat part with that, when we get it set up properly, is you have one username and password that you put in the morning. Say you're logging into your HR tool or your doc management system. And when you log in with that, your phone pings and says, hey, are you trying to log into NetDocuments? You click yes, you're in. Now it just hasn't logged you into NetDocuments. It's also authenticated you to your email, your HR, to a dozen different programs that are going to work for you for the next 4 hours or maybe the next day. and we still know it's you that did it because of that token on that computer. So it's slick and actually makes people's life easier.
And that's a great point, because let's face it, one of the biggest hurdles that you and I face when we're working with lawyers is if you make it too difficult, or it's going to interfere with their daily routine, it's a lot harder of a sell, isn't it?
It's very difficult, absolutely. So if you can show them this and say, hey, by the way, you're going to just have to tap your phone once, it's much easier, they love it.
Well, so this really, this talk about cybersecurity is a great way to segue into really what's happened. It's really been going on for quite some time, but certainly the last year has brought attention to and increased a lot of people really starting to look at virtual offices and remote offices. It's already difficult enough to protect a firm and the data within that firm. Now you have people going off in, half a dozen or a dozen different places, multiple employees connecting to the internet from home. Cybersecurity protection of all that data is just getting a lot more difficult now.
It has been. It's the last year has really been a security nightmare for a lot of people, just because we've spent so many years building these beautiful, highly protected networks in some beautiful buildings. And all of a sudden, you've got an attorney that's working on a home, if they didn't plan well, they're working on a home computer that their kid usually plays games on, off a shared Wi-Fi connection that who knows what's on that, with very little protections. And so it was very sketchy for a few months. A lot of firms are starting to make some strides in that, but we almost have to recognize that every person's remote office, their home now, is a satellite office, and we need to figure out how we're going to best protect that.
I still quiver at the thought that, for many people, people don't even really have a full understanding or even a basic understanding of how your connection at home to Wi-Fi really is. You have a router and you have a modem. Sometimes they're combined, but to this day, even access to those routers and Wi-Fi networks is simple default, admin and password.
It is. Yep, absolutely. And especially for those routers. I'll say this, I've been in a billionaire's home doing a security threat assessment for them. And one of the things I always do is I found their router, I flipped it over, I took a picture of the username and password off it, and then I tested, and sure enough, it worked. And this is an extremely wealthy person that's got unlimited resources to fix it. It's interesting. It's everyone's problem. That they stay with defaults because it's easy. They don't pay attention. Even the Wi-Fi protocols themselves, if you're sitting on a Wi-Fi router that's 2-3 years old, the protocols aren't secure anymore. And so there's some real risk there. Now, that is a more localized risk. Somebody needs to be in the area to do that. But even the firewall that you've got protecting your home network, it's not close to comparing to what you have at the office.
No, and let's face it, anybody that knows a little bit about what they're doing, if you have access to that router, you pretty much get access to everything, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Every website that person visits, passwords, history, everything.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the, when I do speaking engagements, one of my favorite things to do is, I think the last one that I did before the pandemic hit, I was at a hotel, and one of the things that I love to do is, you have the audience, you have 50, 60, 70 people out there, sometimes 100 people waiting for you to talk about cybersecurity. And I always ask, how safe do you believe your client's data is? And, pretty much most of the time, everybody says yes, because they either have an IT department or something like that. And then after a few inquisitive questions, I guess, I'll look at my phone, and then I'll start saying, is there a Craig in the room? Is there a Sarah? Is there a Tom? And you start seeing their faces, kind of light up, right? And essentially what I'll say is, how many of you connected to the hotel Wi-Fi when you got here yesterday or today? And then their face just kind of lights up, and I tell them, well, the first thing that I did yesterday when I got to the hotel was essentially created a fake hotspot, and I just called it, hotel free Wi-Fi or hotel guest. And in an instant, people start connecting to that phone. And
absolutely.
That exercise really puts things into perspective, right? Because it shows them, I tell them, look, that's how easy it is for you to connect to a network in which I control, okay? And really with the click of a few buttons, I can start imaging all of your phones, and you would never even know about it.
And to make matters worse, most people set those to remember those networks. So I've had the same thing where you can open up a Starbucks network nowhere near a Starbucks, which I don't know if that's such a thing, if there is any place that's not near a Starbucks, but people will connect to it because it's a remembered connection. And that gets very scary. And my rule of thumb for everyone is don't connect to Wi-Fi networks that you don't control. Everybody nowadays has 4G, 5G. There's very little reason to connect to that Wi-Fi unless you absolutely have to. And we talk about public networks, but I hate to say this, I'd be concerned about connecting to the Wi-Fi network of a competing law firm. I mean, how much do you trust their cybersecurity, their best intentions? The fact of the matter is, stay on networks that you control. You have to.
What a great point. What a great point. And, you know, and one of the things that could at least protect you in some way are the use of VPNs. Really,
yes.
They're so inexpensive, you know, for a good VPN, you're talking about maybe $40 to $50 a year. And you can cover, you know, many of them use, you know, 3 or 4 licenses, you know, 2 laptops, a phone, and your desktop at home for $40 or $50. And at least you're encrypting that connection between your cell phone or your laptop and that Wi-Fi network that you choose to use, if you choose to use a public one.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the recommendations I make on that, because a VPN is a virtual private network, and a lot of people don't understand how they actually work. And what they need to know is that when you use a VPN, you are trusting that VPN company with all of your traffic. They see all of it. And so when you're dealing with client confidential information, you don't want to be going on the internet and looking for the lowest price VPN service. If your office has a VPN service, you may want to use that for personal use, or if your office approves it. Personally, I use NordVPN. It's been vetted by the security community. I know it's secure, but I do realize they're seeing all my traffic. And so be aware of that when you're looking for VPN companies.
It's the lesser of the two evils, but it's almost like you'd at least rather have the VPN company be the one in charge of that, because at least there's eyes on them, right? The community
absolutely
is looking at them, you know, So what would you say is the number one risk or weakest link facing law firms today when it comes to protecting client data and implementing reasonable cybersecurity measures?
I think really the weakest point still does come back for most law firms to, I'll say 2 things. Number one is the users. User security awareness training, I think, is one of the most important things we can do. And do it frequently. Keep it at the front of people's minds. This is what the threats are nowadays. This is what you can do to protect yourself. The threat landscape is always changing. And so if you did security awareness training a year and a half ago, the threats aren't the same today as they were a year and a half ago. As long as people can understand those threats and the rest of your security team is doing their job, you're in a much better place. One of the things we do is we send out fake phishing emails to a lot of law firms to keep them aware of what the threats are. And I love it when I get an email from an attorney that says, "Hi, you didn't fool me with this one." And it's an actual real phishing attack. It wasn't us.
Oh, I get those too.
It keeps it at the front of their mind. And I love that, because in a way I've gamified it. They are watching for the phishing attack. And if they think it was me, great. At least they didn't click on it.
That's so interesting that you say that, because I get that a lot too. Is, you know, now I'm nervous about opening every email, and I hate to say it, but I'm like, good.
Yeah, err on the side of caution. And then the second thing is, a lot of law firms are focused on preventing the breach, preventing the attack, and they don't put as much work into what happens when the attack happens. Called a right of boom mentality. Someday something's going to explode. It's going to happen. You are going to get breached. There's going to be an event. Any organization that employs human beings, a human being is going to make a mistake at some point, whether it's in setting up the security and giving away their passwords, or letting that nice looking guy walk through the front door and find the server room. There will be a mistake. What do we have in place so that we can identify that mistake and mitigate the risk and the attack of what happens and get them out right away? Going back to the financial firm example, principals give away their passwords to Moscow, and in 5 minutes, we have them knocked out. We had that right of boom mentality, and we really need to focus on that more than just, hey, we're going to make sure this never happens to us. Because unfortunately, when it does happen, sometimes bad actors will sit in the network for half a year just harvesting information because there's nothing there to detect them.
That's really a great point. It's not just attacks aren't always immediate, right? You can have dormant viruses, right? That just literally once they go in, they just sit there and wait. There could be a script written where it's just waiting for something to be typed in particular, an amount of money, and then it wakes up at the right time. And it does.
That's right. Or it can be a human being that's compromised network that's watching the managing partner at a law firm, and how does this person talk? How do they behave? We had one where the managing partner went on vacation. The managing partner sends an email. It's not him, it's a bad actor, but it comes from his email address saying, I'm going to surprise my wife with a Mercedes when I get home. Here's the invoice. Make sure you pay this right away. They wire the money for the Mercedes. He gets back from his European vacation, and accounts payable says, hey, how does Janet like the Mercedes? And his response is, what are you talking about? And the fact of the matter is they sat on that network forever. How do wire transfers happen? What are the relationships? What's the attorney's wife's name? How does he talk? And they crafted it. It looked just like him. And so they paid it. And so that's the danger when they get on the inside.
All right. So then it's been really interesting. And I'd like to close out today's conversation by maybe getting some tips, right? Some tips from you as to what law firms can do today already to protect their client data, enhance their cybersecurity.
Yeah, so my recommendation, number one, would be to think like a bad guy and get somebody in the room that understands cybersecurity and ask yourself, how would you break into your law firm? Because one of the things we need to do is we need to define what are we trying to protect. And so if I say, hey, I want you to break into your house, you're probably going to go, okay, where would the keys be hidden? What window could I knock in? That sort of thing. If we think about that, then we know where to focus our energies on what to protect. And so the easy ones, backups. Number one, backups. Get them in a secure place and make sure they work. And then the next thing really, especially in our distributed environment, is next-gen AV. Don't just go out and buy the cheap antivirus that you can off the internet or at Target or wherever. Make sure you have an intelligent next-gen AV that's watching for behaviors, not just for those signatures, and get that in place really quickly. Those two put you in a much, much better position just by itself, and then user awareness training. Get your people trained so they know what the threats are and so they can communicate back to the team. I think if you do those three things, you are in a far better position than you were before.
So no free software, right?
No free software. I would say the one exception for that is if you're communicating with clients on highly confidential matters, texting is a terrible solution. That is where I recommend Signal. Signal is a free solution, and it is vetted, and it works phenomenally well. But that is probably the only time you'll ever hear me recommend go with a free solution.
Yeah.
And I should mention a fourth thing, because I always do, multi-factor authentication. Get it turned on everything and learn how to use it. Because what that means is when I trick you into giving me your username and password, I'm not in your system.
All right. And hopefully I'm going to have you back pretty soon where we'll actually spend some time talking about Signal and those type of security components. Now, one last thing I'd like to say is that don't rely, because everybody's going to the cloud now, don't just rely on having your information on the cloud. Having information on the cloud, stored on the cloud, does not mean that it's completely safe. People should still be doing backups of that data and keeping it for themselves and keeping the wires not connected.
100%.
Right? All right. Well, Craig, thank you very much once again for joining us today. I really appreciate you know your stuff, and that's why I love talking to you about it all the time. For those of you that are listening, this is Carlos Baradat. We're the Virtual Jurist, and we'll see all of you very soon.
Thanks, everybody.